come on our session and a panel, really for
Thank
finding the time. It's a great pleasure for me, and just reading your book and especially a conversation with you. So if you allow me, let me give a small introduction as an author. Ira has already written, I think, 3 books on the Mughal history. First was the Queens and the Begums of Mughal Empire. No, heroines and a power. No, first was the heroines and a powerful Indian women in a myth and history. Then second one was very fascinating book. I didn't read that one, the first one. So, but I read the last book that was written, Daughters of a Sun. Really amazing book, a great research in which you explored many facets. That was really new for me, and I know that many readers has not gone through it. Now, this one, Akbar, the Great Mughal, was released this year. Surya, can you little bit share that how your journey of writing towards history, because you graduated from science and you have coming from a different platform. So how this interest was generated and how you came up at this point?
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me here with you this evening. So my journey, I think, like for a lot of writers, was very accidental. I didn't start out, as you were saying. I went into the sciences. I did 5 years of biology and natural sciences. So we have that in common, you and I. And then I worked for a little while in the area and found that I didn't enjoy it very much. So for a while, I got into, I had family matters to look after, and then I had my daughters. And it was when they were still small that I thought, we live in a small nuclear family. I grew up in a nuclear family, so we didn't have those ancient structures of storytelling, of myth making. The whole system which helps us in creating foundation myths for ourselves. At the familial level. You can do it at the national level, but you also do it at a family level. Often grandparents will give you, or you have a structure which tells you all these stories. Where did you come from? Who were your ancestors? What was your culture? But I had a little bit of a deracinated, childhood, because my father left Bangladesh at the time of partition and came to Delhi. So I did not have any of the links with my language, Bengali, with that culture. So I felt that when I was raising my daughters, how would I reinvent history for them? What would I tell them? And there was the danger otherwise that they would purely be assimilated into an Anglophone sort of environment with, the larger cultural context. So I was interested in looking at specifically Indian women that would be inspiring for my daughters as they grew up. And that's what led me to start looking at heroic Indian women. And I found that a lot of them did not feel like real women. They seemed somehow they had been whitewashed. They all seemed very bland, homogenized. Their lives seemed to fit into a same sort of, patriarchal structure, that they all ended up looking and feeling the same. And I thought that this could not be possible. Draupadi, I know it was not this sort of figure which in the Bollywood, in the series they show us, always full of jewelry and very fair skinned. That was not the Draupadi that I had read about. So I realized that a lot of manipulation of female figures had happened. And I thought it might be an interesting exercise to look at this more, deeply, and look at it in terms of a book. And that's how I got my idea for my first book.
So this is how the first book started, and then the second book is also something amazing about it, and the same connection that when you bring about the Daughters of Sun, so the first time the readers, basically outside the spheres of history, we can say history lovers, academicians definitely know about it, but hidden in the form of research articles, journals, old archival accounts, the life beside the harem, and this is something that has a great impact in the creation of Mughal Empire. And still in this book, when we are going to talk very soon on the Akbar, you will have bring the essence of that, how these ladies has a greater influence in running the big show of Mughal Empire, or one of the mightiest empire of the time.
Exactly. So as you say, exactly, the academics know all this. I am not saying anything new, but the form in which it is communicated, for a general audience in a storytelling manner, and also in a manner which shows that through 200 years, this was not a static harem that we are talking about. This is not one space which is same for 200 years. Nobody changes. They all look the same. They behave the same. That was not true. It was a dynamic sort of exchange of ideas and how these women, evolved in their influence. So that was what I wanted to be able to communicate to a lay audience in a storytelling manner, if you like.
Exactly. Ira, can you... Sorry, there was some interruption in between. Can you just show the book to the audiences on which we want to talk? If the hard copy is there, because I don't have a hard copy, or otherwise we can carry on. No issues for that.
I didn't think to put that.
Okay. So no issues for that. So let me. You want to say something about the manuscript in journal, or I will introduce about the book? Whatever.
No, please go ahead, and then we'll.
Okay. So the book exactly. What, as a reader, I want to say something that. The book has a very nice cover page with a very good painting. Ira will share about that painting, where she selected it and why it became a cover page. Then with the title, you will go across, you will find a very good cast of characters. That's the introductory notes, chronological events, and introducing characters in really a very good manner. That's I can say someone who is not acquainted with the Mughal history, or any reader who didn't know that who was that painter, who, from where they come up, who was Hamida Banu Begum, who was Bairam Khan, some general background, who is not very well acquainted, he can have an idea, so he can weave and connect the story what he is going to read. Then the book is divided into 6 parts. Then that's definitely Ira is going to tell about it. And it is further subdivided into subsections that articulate the biographical notes of Akbar, interwoven with the stories of culture, food, politics, war, and definitely a big role of females. Again, her area of specialization, that how these Mughal females or Mughal women, or I can say that Timurids male and Chingizids females, what you use a special term for that will come on the questions. So this is how I can say a general outline of this book.
Yes. So exactly. When we look at the historians and the history books coming out of other countries. For example, if we look at Akbar's exact contemporary, Elizabeth I in England, there are literally hundreds of biographies of Elizabeth I. We are so intimately acquainted with each aspect of her court, her people, and I wanted something like that for Akbar. That not even the people, even the animals, people should understand. What were the names of his favorite animals, his favorite elephants, the dogs, the cheetahs, the ladies, the women in his life, how integral they were in the evolution of the empire, the men also, so that we understand them as human beings and we can recognize, our same humanity in them. So this was a very important exercise. And so that it wouldn't become overwhelming, I thought a cast of characters was very important. And after I read my manuscript the first time, I took out a lot of names which were not crucial to the storyline, because I did not want people to get unnecessarily overwhelmed by the names which were unfamiliar to them. So we limited the number of names, hoping that in this way people will really remember the people. In terms of the layout of the book, as you say, there are 6 parts. And the first part is, essentially the introduction of the empire, the Mughals, where they came from, Timur, all of that. And the next 5 chapters, the way I saw it, are made up of 10 to 12 chapters, which are short in size so that people can, easily assimilate the information. But each section basically, covers a very important decade in Akbar's. When some major achievement is happening at that time, whether it is a battle, whether it is a work of art, whether it is the forming of a city. So something very essential happens in that one section. So people can even read one section, leave it aside, and come back a few days later, a few weeks later, and they can still pick up the story without getting confused. So that was my idea, because there's so much information that I'm trying to convey, and I don't want it to become overwhelming for a lay audience.
I think this is really a wonderful idea of writing and compiling a book in a way that every section is connected with each other, definitely, but they are also separated. So each of the section can be continued, and this is really a nice way that can give a good connect with the book for the readers. So let's talk about from our book now exactly. So when we go on the chapter 1, that as you told, that it is a succinct background of the Timurid Empire, how it was created, and how from a very small scale Timur started, and then he moved on and he became one of the biggest conqueror of the world, and then his matrimonial alliances especially, and the title that Amir Timur, he didn't go for the title of the king. Exactly, he cannot go to the Khan. Khan is reserved only for the descendants of Genghis Khan. So he'd make other idea, the matrimonial alliances worked, and that certainly the word Gurgan you used, or Gurkani, this word I have heard before also, very familiar in your previous book. So
Yes.
something about it.
Right. Well, this is,
Just
as you were saying, it's very important to link back to the origin and the women, because I will just explain it to you, because it makes a lot of sense when we look at the Mughal Empire later on. Now, Timur, when he became a very successful warlord in the middle of the 14th century, thereabouts, he was in this area which is called, Transoxania, basically the Turan region. So,
yes,
modern, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, that area. And Samarkand was his city. So this region, after about 150 years had passed since Genghis Khan had died, and his empire had fragmented by the time Timur came up. But his charisma, the memory of his power, his glory was very much present in all these lands. So when Timur was coming up as this warlord with not much of an impeccable background, his lineage was not very impressive. He was just a nomadic warlord of a small region, and he needed to find some way to add the charisma of Genghis Khan to his name, even though he himself was not of that lineage. And
yeah,
he thought to marry Chingizid women. And moreover, he married his sons also to Chingizid women who were of the direct lineage of Genghis
yes,
Khan. So in this manner, he was in a sense able to appropriate that power and charisma of Genghis Khan's name, and in a what looked like supposedly a submissive title. Guregen means in-law dynasty. So it
in-law
seems like
dynasty.
in-laws. So they were the dynasty of the in-laws of Genghis Khan. And in deference to this, he never took the title Khan, as you pointed out, because only Genghis Khan was the Khan, and he only remained Amir Timur, and it was only Babur later on who became Padshah Babur. So this was the origin of the Guregen or Gurgenia lineage, which is the way that they always refer to themselves as the in-law dynasty.
So
And
Gurgan,
then
in fact, is a word from Turkish language or Turki language or Central Asian language.
Yeah, Central Asian, and it became Persianized to become Guregen. Yeah.
Gurgan.
And then when Babur came up, he no longer wished so much to associate. He was not as interested in the Genghis Khan lineage as his Timurid lineage. For him,
Yeah.
that was more important because his cousins and his enemies, the Uzbeks, were also Genghis Khan descendants. They were the Mongols, and he hated them. So he did not want to be associated with them. Today, if you go to Uzbekistan, they refer to the Mughals of India as Baburids, descendants of.
Baburids, because in fact they are not Mongols. They are not.
They are not
They
Mongols.
came from the
Right.
different lineages.
That's right.
So this is again a misnomer. Yes.
This is a misnomer,
Yeah.
and in fact, Babur would be horrified because he hated the Uzbeks and he thought they were the Mongols, they were barbaric and they were brutish.
Yeah.
Where the
Yeah.
Timurids were, great builders and lovers of architecture.
Yeah, definitely, because just to tell you that some questions are coming in, but they are not. We will took it at the later. Like our friend wrote a question: why polarized views about Akbar, his religion, Anarkali, Salim fandom, princely states? A lot of questions Asad Bhai asked. Why Deen-e Ilahi? Yes, we will come, and Deen-e Ilahi, why considered like this? We have all in our book, and slowly we'll come on this part. And when we'll come on this part, probably you'll get your answer. And if not, then we will at the end we will give the answer. If it is connected to this part, you can ask question. So.
Okay.
By the way, just to add that, in Old Delhi, there is one of our friend and his father, Mirza Naseem Changezi and Mirza Sikandar Changezi. They used to say like 27th, sometime you say with Rana Appa's pictures, and many stories has been written on him. So he proudly says that we are real Chingizids and Mughals are Gurkhanis. They are not Mongols. We are real Mughals. Yeah, we are real Mughals. And he claimed to be 27th descendant, and he has their own family tree. Yes, they have their family trees. And they say that during the time of Akbar, they migrated somewhere from the Sindh, because Genghis Khan's descendant has disseminated in different parts with the small princely states. So they were one of the offshoots of Chingizids in Purani Delhi.
Wonderful.
Yeah, really, I did a small story on him and his family in Live History India. They translated it in English. Live History India.
Oh, wonderful! That's a wonderful story to hear.
So thank you, Ira. Let's go on with our talk. So again, from here came the role of some strong females like Ehsan Daulat Begum, Pultuk Nigar Khanum, and they all helped Babur in expansion of his lost legacy or lost ancestral legacy, because being a descendant of Timur, he think that all the dominion what Timur has acquired was his right to recapture, or just to make it authentication to his expeditions.
Correct. Correct. So the problem with that is that when in 1494 his father died, he was only 12 years old. So very difficult, at that age to have such big ambitions. And the problem also rises with the Timurid system of co-sovereignty. They did not have a system of primogeniture where the elder son or heir automatically inherits the throne upon the death of his father. In their system of co-sovereignty, every child, every sibling has a right to claim the throne if they are capable, people. So this makes for a very dangerous situation when the king dies, because all the brothers, the cousins, the uncles will be in competition immediately. And Babur knew this at the age of 12, that his cousins and his uncles were a deadly, a danger for him. So he rushes back to Fergana. He is the prince of Fergana now, but he only has his mother and his grandmother that he can really trust. All the other male relatives are a source of danger to him. But luckily, these women, as you mentioned, are very admirable. They're courageous. They're very intelligent. In fact, in his Babur Nama, Babur writes about his grandmother, Ehsan Daulat Begum, that in the advice and the war tactics that she gave, she was supreme. There was nobody else like her.
Yeah.
She was able to, she was able to keep all the other noblemen's feelings, in balance, and kept the situation in control, which was otherwise a very volatile situation for a 12-year-old boy who was trying to, claim kingship of Fergana. So for 5 years, they sort of carry on in a pretty, it isn't a very stable situation. It is volatile. There are many other pretenders, but these women, his mother and his grandmother, keep him safe. And they reach Samarkand. And over there, it is now no longer his uncles and his brothers who are challenged to him. It is the Uzbeks. Now, the Uzbeks have been rising in force at this time, and Shebani Khan, Uzbek, besieges the city, and Babur is reduced after 6 months to, I think they have to eat donkeys and things like horses and things like that to survive. They are in a very difficult situation. And finally, to escape with his life and to continue to try and reclaim his lands, he has to give his elder sister Khanzada Begum over to Shebani Khan Uzbek, who asks for her as a hostage if Babur is to leave with his life. So this is what happened. So Khanzada Begum remains in Samarkand with Shebani Khan Uzbek. She becomes his wife, and Babur leaves with his mother and his grandmother. Eventually ends up in Kabul, again under the care of these ladies who continue to look after him and share all his hardships and tribulations. And in Kabul, one after the other, both of them die. But by then, he has created a semblance of of the beginning of a kingdom.
So this is how the ladies of the Mughal harem just play a key role from the very first day in the establishment of the empire. So again, childhood of the Akbar, because in the circumstances when he was born, his father has lost everything, and it was like a wanderings from one place to other place. And in that childhood, when Akbar was born, and then Akbar was raised with his uncle Kamran, and you painted a very vivid stories that how sibling rivalries there, and again the same issues of their laws. So Kamran was also equally contender of the empire like Humayun, and the situation was there. So there was a kettle drum event. That's a very interesting, like a sibling rivalry. Even today we talk about, we consulted pediatric psychologists sometime for these issues, sometime within cousins, sometime with the real brothers, sisters. So this is event is really connecting event with the, can you please share something about that?
Definitely. So, as you say, when his parents left for Persia, Hamida Banu and Humayun have to run away literally to Persia. Akbar is taken in first by Askari Mirza, his younger uncle, and then Kamran.
Yes.
And I think Kamran is the most ambitious. He's younger only by 1 year to Humayun, and he has the same ambitions. He is a very capable general, actually. He has a lot of talent, so he doesn't see why he shouldn't inherit the throne of Hindustan. He feels that he is more capable than Humayun.
Yes.
So he keeps Akbar with him as hostage while Humayun is traveling in Persia. And then slowly, they start hearing that Humayun has got the help of the Shah of Persia, and he may be coming on, back with reinforcements, with troops, with money. And at this point, interesting, as you say, incident happens is that Kamran's own son, Ibrahim Mirza, is a little older to Akbar. Now, Akbar at this point is around 2.5 years old.
2.5 years.
Yes, and his cousin is a few years older, and he gets a gift of small kettle drums, Ibrahim Mirza, and he roams around playing those drums. And Akbar is very delighted with this toy, and he wants to play on the drums as well. And Kamran, since by now he is very irritated by Humayun, he tries to take it out on his son and heir. So he tells Akbar, both of you, why don't you have a wrestling competition, and whoever wins can keep the drums. And he is confident that his older son will easily be able to defeat Akbar. And Akbar is so small. But even at 2.5 years, we are told that Akbar is able to grab his cousin by the around the waist, lift him up, and throw him to the floor. And all his attendants come rushing and they, clapping and cheering for him. And of course, Kamran Mirza is so annoyed by this. I think for him, perhaps he must be thinking that this foretells his future, because these people used to look at auguries and superstitions and all these signs. And he must have been, very upset by this. And he said immediately this child is to be weaned from his milk mothers. And this is unusual to us today in the 21st century. We don't, nurse our children for so long. But in the 16th century, children were often nursed till the age of 5 or 6. So at the age of 2.5, he wants to deprive this child of the comfort of his milk mothers. And he said, no more, nursing for Akbar from now on.
So again, here interesting, because this is not in our part, but Koka's roles also came in later. So there are a lot of foster mothers, and this was a part of the culture, in the tribal culture, and even in Arabic culture also. In the early Islam we find it. The mother of the Prophet was also carried on with these foster brothers, foster mothers, and they kept a lot of privilege. So Koka exactly is a term used again in a Central Asian language, or it is a Persian word?
I think it's Turkey origin.
It's a Turkey origin, because Koka we find at many places there is Koka. And one Koka, I remember that, Sheikh Salim Chishti, you talk about a lot in your book. His son-in-law is Ibrahim.
Yes.
So Ibrahim, Ibrahim's son, Sheikh Kutubuddin Koka, was a foster brother of Jahangir.
Oh, right. Yes.
And they got a big legacy in Badaयूं, the city of sultans. That was before a very important and strategic place. So Badaयूं, you will find a lot of tombs that belong to the descendant of Kutubuddin Koka.
Interesting. Yes.
So they become a governor of Katiyar, they become governor of Rohilkhand, and they got a lot of concessions till the time of Shah Jahan. Even one of his son was married to the sister of Mumtaz Mahal.
Oh my goodness.
Her home is still in very ruined condition in Badaयूं.
Right. Yes, they had a lot of power and privilege once they became.
So Kokas plays a lot of role, and the family is connected for a long time. They got the privileges. So again, in these days of wandering, you talk about in your book a very detailed and fine accounts of Humayun, because rather than exile, some scholars argued, but your book put a very fine details that this is not an exile. This is a time of a cultural blending. Or we can say like a sort of a renaissance, where there was a lot of blending from the Persian culture, because they got a time, this proximity with the Persian culture. Persian artists came up from the very, at least of Shah Tahmasp, and also the amalgamation of a Turki and Persian cuisine. As you see the circumcision of Akbar, the celebration, you will find both of the elements there. And also generation of the interest of Humayun towards the book, keeping the libraries, making a lot of collections. So this all happened there. Can you please just reflect a little bit, because this is really a good part that you research in your book?
Yes, this is something that I was very interested to come upon, because I had the idea, like I think most of us who have not read very deeply into the history text, we think that Humayun was a bit of a dilettante. He lost his empire. He was too busy with the harem, with opium. This is the sort of opinion that is a post-colonial legacy.
Yeah, this is a general perception that is created all around.
It is created, and it is felt that Kabul, because of today's boundaries of Hindustan, Kabul was not part of the empire. But the fact is, Kabul was the first capital of the Mughal Empire. Babur ruled there for 20 years.
20 years.
And yes. So similarly, Humayun, when he comes, as I was describing earlier, when he comes from Persia and back to conquer his land and to conquer Kabul from Kamran. So he is a very different man now. He has 14,000 soldiers with him, some excellent generals, the Uzbeks, the brothers, and he has a lot of the tenting material which Shah Tahmasp has given him. He has a lot of money. So he comes as a very different man to the sort of man who was chased out of his empire by Sher Shah Suri. He comes with a lot of Persian materials and even artists, because at this point is when Shah Tamas had been going through, he had been a keen patron of art himself, but he was going through a phase of Toba, and his artists were slowly leaving his court. So
Yeah.
Akbar comes back to Kabul and he invites some of these Persian artists to Kabul to join him to set up a Tasveer Khana. And they do. Two great Persian artists, Abdul Samad, uh, they come and they join him and they set up this Tasveer Khana in Kabul for him. He brings back also, as you were saying, the legacy of the food that he has eaten. And I want to just show you, I'll show one image depicting the court at this time. This
Sure,
shows
sure.
something a little bit different. Can we see the first one?
Yeah. See where it is exactly, and then I will share it with the screen.
There you go. I think we can see it now.
Okay, let me put it here.
Can you see it now?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. It is there on the screen.
Okay, so this is an image depicting the court at Kabul at this point. There's Humayun in the center on the top, and there's a woman sitting with a child on her knee, and that is Hamida Banu with Akbar, who has just recognized her amongst many other women, supposedly. And behind her are more, timid women. So maybe that is Gulbadan. There is maybe Bega Begum, who has come back also from exile at Sher Shah Suri. And on the right, there are women who are wearing more simple clothes. And these are probably the milk mothers, Mahamanga, Gigi Anga. And we see celebrations. We see women dancing. We see at the lower part, men dancing with the sword, musicians, all kinds of, musicians playing on different instruments. So this is a very lively and rich courtly culture which is beginning to shape around the time of Humayun living here. So it is quite wrong to think that nothing happened at this court and it was a time of exile and penance for Humayun. On the contrary, he is also setting up, if I can show the next picture. Can we show the next one, Rehan?
Yeah. Just you need to click it. It will appear
Yeah.
here.
Okay. Can we go to the next one? I think this is
let me just change it on your laptop, and then I will project it.
This is the
Have
one.
Let me put it on the screen. Yeah, but I don't know why it's not changed. Maybe it takes some time.
Maybe
This is the one.
Is it the one with the blue rocks and the red rocks in the background?
No. I think this is the same previous one. What we are showing it.
Okay.
Let me just. It need to be changed. This is Apple or Windows desktop.
This is Apple.
Apple. Okay, because in that maybe sometime. Just I will again on the screen. You have projected the.
Yes. It is an image with lots of red and blue, rock formations. So there's lots of red and blue and a number of different people in it.
Yeah, and can you see that it's changed? No, I
For
think
me,
it's.
no.
Yeah, for me, it's appearing the same one. What I'm showing it here.
I'm not sure. What are you seeing, Rehan?
Yeah, what I'm seeing here is the same previous one, but here there is a Humayun is sitting in the court and two ladies, and in the background we can blow some of the courtiers at the lower end. It is in the 3 tiers. So top is a Humayun, second is some females, and at the lower end some of the Sardars are standing.
No, this is not the one. Should I escape it and try again?
Yeah, escape it and try again, I think.
Try again.
Yeah, now change. Yes, it's changed. Yes, now just you. Yes. Now it is appearing. Yes, you can define it now.
Yeah. Okay. So this is now being considered the first datable Mughal painting. According to scholars such as Laura Parodi, who've done a lot of work on it, they are dating this tentatively to 1545. So this is a very early painting from the Kabul years of Humayun. And if you look at the details and the colors, how rich and vibrant they are, then this shows a Tasveer Khana which has a lot of money, which has a lot of excellent painters, which is doing a very fine job of detailing the image that they're trying to, in the sort of, message that they're trying to convey. So this is not an amateurish attempt that we sort of, associate Humayun with. And indeed, he can therefore be considered the founder of Mughal paintings in India, and not, we think it is Akbar, but actually it is Humayun. And this painting initially was thought to be Humayun and his brothers in a landscape in Kabul. But the scholars who have looked at it very closely, you can see two groups of ladies one on the left middle side and one on the top. So these are thought to be on the left Timurid ladies, Hamida Banu, Gulbadan and her sisters, and on the top it's the Mahamanga, again perhaps the milk mothers, standing next to Akbar. And behind them, if you can see the rock formations in blue,
Yes.
look like an elephant. They have the shape of an elephant. And
Ah,
possibly, yeah, if you look at it carefully, there's an elephant
yes.
with two tusks. And
Yes.
possibly this refers to the Sufi Sheikh Ahmed of Jam, also known as the colossal elephant, because he was a very big size. And this is related to Hamida because she is believed to be of his lineage, and Humayun sees him in a dream foretelling the birth of Akbar. So this image is now believed to be around the circumcision ceremonies, the fertility rites in Kabul around Akbar. So it is something which celebrates the women, this sort of aspect of Timurid life, and it definitely does not show a very poor court, but one which is rich in traditions and legacies and in this artistic tradition. So I will just escape this for now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Want to
So
show any other, or can I remove the screen?
no, for now, that's fine. For now, this is fine. So just to show that, these paintings that were being developed with these two Persian artists, Mir Saeed Ali and Abdul Samad, this was a proper full-fledged artistic production. There were not many paintings being made, just a few, but they were of the finest quality. So they show Humayun's, as a patron, he was very learned, he was very appreciative, and he had a fine taste for beautiful art. And as you say, all these influences, the foods, they have brought back, from 2 years spent in Persia, they have brought back certain culinary traditions which will also join the Mughal tradition. The sharbats of rose
Yes.
water, the preserves of jams of watermelon and grape, all these, and pilaus, all these sort of elements of Persian culture have also been brought along with the Turkey elements, and they had started to form this amalgamation and mixing of culture. It already happens here in Kabul.
So we can say like these two painters or the artists coming from the court from Shah of Persia, this was like a founding stone of the legacy of Mughal painting and art that flourished down with the centuries and assimilated in India with the Indian culture and Indian color. And Akbar, though, propagated it at a very much higher scale or the wider scale, but the founder was a living court of Kabul under the kingship of Humayun
Absolutely.
or during the days of Humayun.
Yeah.
So again, we are moving on with the formative days of Akbar, because he has some sort of repulsion from the written words, or we can what we say today as a structured formal education. So always a gray area hanged around it. Maybe the child was dyslexic. Some says it is like autistic child, as you also defined it in your terms. That what in the modern pediatrician will say that this is like a autistic behavior, that he's always away from the, and he enjoy playing outside in the fields. And this, but perhaps this field learning played a great role again in building empire. When we saw the Akbar after 10 years, immediately when he went on sincerely towards looking the empire after Bahram Khan, you find that this experience played a key role. So, but some foster brothers use the environment of learning, like you say that in Ghazni again, there is a lot of chances given to the Akbar for the study. And this is again the code that was created or environment that was created by Humayun. So what is disadvantage at one end, that written word, he has a repulsion, but he learned a lot in the fields.
Absolutely.
His play, his expeditions, his huntings. So,
Yeah.
So something you want to say around this?
Yeah, so this is an interesting point, because we wonder how somebody so learned, somebody who had so much knowledge, who knew so much about textual matters and human beings, and he was so intelligent. How was he what we call illiterate? And in today's age, illiteracy is somehow defined by poverty. We think it is only because you are poor, you don't have access. It is a degraded condition. So first, we have to understand that in the 16th century, that doesn't necessarily, have to mean that, because there's the example of Prophet Muhammad, who was supposedly illiterate, Timur himself. So they are exalted examples, So if you are illiterate and yet a very knowledgeable person, you can go to those examples and say that this is almost a knowledge which is coming to me. I don't even need books to gain this sort of knowledge. So that is one thing to remember. It doesn't have the same connotation in the 16th century as in the 21st century. But the fact remains that Humayun was someone who loved books so much. And for him, it would have been very important for his son and heir to have a proper Timurid education. This was very important for him and for the Timurids. So, how did this happen? That he was not a good calligrapher, a good reader? How did this happen? So, even I was initially thinking, could it be something like what we today would call attention deficit
Yeah,
disorder?
that's why a sort of attention deficit disorder.
Yeah, so that you
Sort of
cannot
autism.
I was thinking maybe that is a lot of boys today are diagnosed with attention disorder, deficit disorder, ADD. So perhaps he had a form of that. He could not concentrate. But there is another image that shows that this was not really the case. Can we show this one, please, Vahan?
Yeah, let me add it here. Yes.
So if we look at this painting, which shows a very wonderful thing, it is also of the Humayuni, the time of Humayun. And up on the right, I have shown a close-up of Humayun and Akbar sitting in a tree house, and Akbar is presenting a painting to Humayun. And in fact, the painting that he is presenting is this very painting, the one that we are seeing on the left.
Yes.
So scholars have assumed that this means that this painting has a particular significance for Akbar and for Humayun, and he probably added to it himself. He also added to the creation of this painting, and therefore he was a painter, as we know he was, because there are written records saying
Yes.
that he had painting classes. So if that was the case, now I'm coming out of this, if he was able to learn painting, and you will know that the art of painting took a lot of concentration. You had to sit with your haunches folded, your knees folded. You had your paints around you, and you had to concentrate very finely for hours at a time to create a painting. So then he clearly would not have suffered from something like ADD if he was able to paint. Another possibility, therefore, is something like dyslexia, which today scholars are saying that perhaps he had dyslexia, which means that he did not see letters the way that we see them. They were inverted for him, so he could not easily learn how to read. So that perhaps makes more sense. But as a result of that, he would always run away from his classes. Whenever a scholar was assigned to become a tutor for him, immediately Akbar would run away and start flying his pigeons or racing the camels or looking for animals and his kokas, his milk brothers, and all of them playing. And I think this experiential way of learning about the world organically, directly, viscerally, really shaped Akbar into the man he was to become. He was a man who could understand by looking at a person what talent they had in them, whether they were likely to be loyal, whether they were likely to be good men, to be men you could have faith in. And I think all these traits of his he developed in this countryside of Kabul, in this experiential way of learning that he had through basically inhabiting those things, the animals, the people, the places. And this was how later on in life also when he comes into contact with different religions, he doesn't just want to learn about it or hear about the stories. He wants to live it, So we might come into it later on, but this is how he actually started doing things like Surya Namaskar. He doesn't just want to hear about sun worship. He wants to do sun worship himself. He wants to So it shapes the man that he was to become, and I think it was a very good thing, actually.
And also his interpersonal skills was evolved during these learnings. The way he deal with Bairam Khan, the way he deal with Mahamanga, the way he deal with his enemies, the way he deal with his friends, it all played a great role. So as we saw that during 24th January 1556, there was a great power vacuum that was created with the death of Humayun. But at that time, the empire was quite fragile and Akbar was very young. So the Bairam Khan plays a very great role in consolidating it and definitely saving the Mughals' might in India. Otherwise, the history would be different. The Tarun Verma question will come up here because he asked some question here. What went wrong with Indian rulers that led to re-emergence of Humayun into power and then late foundation of Akbar rules later? So this was the circumstances, we see the political circumstances, but somehow we can say that he could be an architect of empire, Bairam Khan.
Absolutely.
But again, yeah. So, but again, we saw Akbar years later when he was thrown out. The farewell was quite humble. When he was stripped of his power, his administrative titles, when he tried to exploit it, and suddenly Akbar recognized the way he acted The way it was in the medieval ages, maybe he could be more cruel, he could be more brutal, but he carried it like Khan Baba or someone who is a fatherly figure, and he was giving a good farewell. So something on this account, because this is very detailed, we cannot cover it in such a detail, but at least something from you.
Yeah, well, I think great destinies don't just happen only by the person's talent. I think a little bit of luck is always necessary for these sort of destinies. And when Humayun died, and Akbar was so young, I think about 13, he was very lucky to have somebody so talented as Bairam Khan next to him, because whatever happened later on, Bairam Khan was immediately able to step in, sort out all the quarrels between, because all the leading noblemen, there were all kinds of tensions and volatility between the different clans, the Turki versus the Persians, and so on and so forth. All men with a lot of sense of ego and arrogance. So he was able to control things very quickly. And when the first danger came up, the serious danger of Hemu, who was then calling himself Hemchandra Vikramaditya, and he came to Delhi to conquer Delhi. He was basically, a general of the Surs, and he came with all his Afghan soldiers and noblemen. And it was a really serious challenge to this fledgling Mughal empire. And Turdi Beg, who was at that time assigned to Delhi, he was roundly defeated, and he ran away from Delhi, and he was proposing going all the way to Kabul. And he said, let us leave Delhi altogether and first retire to Kabul and then see. But Bairam Khan realized that this was a very important moment, which things could go either way for Akbar. He was so young that if they left entirely and gave up the Delhi, then their challenge was over. So he reorganized the forces, brought back all the Mughal soldiers, of course, kept Akbar separate from the battle because he was still too young, only 13. He kept him surrounded by 3,000 horsemen, and he fought Hemu. It was a very, very heated battle, and it could have gone either way. And again, chance comes in because Hemu was hit through the eye by a chance arrow, and he slumps over in his howdah, and all the great generals, when they see that their leader is probably dead, they all disperse into the countryside, and Hemu was captured, and then, as we know, killed. And Bairam Khan uses this excuse to also get rid of Turdi Beg, and because he was his great rival. Turdi Beg was this Turki general who considered himself of much better lineage than this Persian, Bairam Khan, and he gets rid of Turdi Beg, and he gets control for the next some years. But when at this time Akbar is not very interested in rule, he's again interested in the countryside. He's discovered elephants. He is so delighted with elephants. He tries to tame elephants. So he's quite happy to stay in the background doing all these things. But then when it comes to a stage where Bairam Khan is taking too much power, when he is not even making sure that Akbar is assigned enough in terms of money for his expenses, when
Yes,
all
exactly.
decisions, yes, he has to ask Mahamanga, who has to give him some money from her own purse, So then suddenly Akbar starts to realize that he has let things slip out of his control. And he says we must start having twice weekly meetings where all decisions will first be presented, all matters will be presented to me, and then the decision will be taken. The harem starts getting involved at this time. Hamida Banu and Mahamanga together, they start telling Akbar that this is a dangerous situation for him. Bairam Khan is taking too much power, making erratic decisions unilaterally, and he has to now step up to his destiny. And which is what he does, as you say. And a coup d'etat of sort is mounted at this time, and all the noblemen come to Delhi. Akbar comes to Delhi, and a message is sent to Bairam Khan that his services are no longer required, and he is to now go to Mecca. So for a while, Bairam Khan, he tries to, he's obviously very distressed. He is also very upset because he had all this power and he doesn't understand how suddenly it is out of his grasp, how Akbar has managed to turn things around so quickly. So he starts, instead of going towards Mecca, he goes towards the Punjab. Akbar sees this as a challenge, as a threat, and Bairam Khan is brought back, almost in chains to Delhi. And he has to submit to the emperor. And Akbar makes him sit next to him and calls him very kindly, puts his arm on his shoulder, calls him Khan Baba like he did before. But basically, he says, you must now leave this empire. And he says, now you must go to Mecca.
Yeah, there was a punishment, but there was a soft tone. There was a lot of respect.
Yes,
Yeah.
lot of respect, because I'm sure he appreciated how much he looked after him when he was most vulnerable. So there was nothing cruel done. It was very normal to be sent to Mecca in those days. That was a very
Yeah,
recognized punishment.
that was a very recognized and very, I think, a spiritual sort of punishment,
Absolutely.
which the least can be done in those
Yeah,
ages.
exactly.
So,
Exactly.
so when we go to your book, it's like a shades or the phases connecting the different ages of Akbar, because it's a long time, 50 years of rule almost close to that, 5 decades. So it's like a different shades of, and every time is a new phase of Akbar. One Akbar was young, leaving everything on what we say that uh, really playing with the animals, making a sense with the nature, and doing his hunting expedition, and rest of the empire is taken care by Bairam Khan or Mahamanga. But suddenly we saw there is a new phase started with the fusion of Rajasthani culture with the Timurid Empire. As we know, the arrival of Harka Bai and of Adam Khan's. These two incidents mark with the commencement of a new phase in the Akbar's life. Many new experiences were felt. Like a biggest one is the abolishment of jizya. This is one of the in the same chronology, granting lands to the temple, especially with the Mathura. That's a major example, and then a major change in the policies. So there was a swift this transition. How much swift was that? Old alliances was Turkey and Persian,
Yeah.
built on the Afghan. I think the major workforce of the soldiers from Afghan, and then nobility was from Turkey and Persian background. And suddenly, the new element, very old and ancient, the Rajput element, is incorporated within the families, and a complete switch in the culture and change. This is a new phase. So, how swift it was, and how much change it happens.
It seems to happen very quickly, because in I think it was 1561 we have the Adham Khan incident. So what happens in very shortly is that he is sent to fight Baz Bahadur in Malwa, and he does so, and he captures. Baz Bahadur is a famous patron of art and
Yes, yes,
culture. So he has a lot in his court, a lot of witches. He has dancers, he has a lot of money as well. So Adham Khan takes all of these things, and he only sends back a few elephants to the court, to Akbar. So Akbar knows what has happened. And he makes, I think this is the first time that he makes a decision on his own account to do something about a nobleman, about what is happening in his empire. And he decides immediately with just a few noblemen, so that not too many people get to know, without telling Mahamanga. Up till this point, Mahamanga knows everything that Akbar is doing. Everything first goes via Mahamanga. This time, Akbar is acting for the first time without telling Mahamanga, without telling anybody but his own coterie, because Adham Khan is, of course, Mahamanga's son. And he rides in a great hurry to confront Adham Khan. Now, nothing much happens at the point, but Adham Khan understands that something has changed. The next day, the harem arrives, Mahamanga arrives, and she sees that Adham Khan has again kept two of these dancing. All the rest he submits before Akbar, but two of the dancing girls, the special ones, he has kept for himself. And Mahamanga realizes that this will be the end of Adham Khan if Akbar realizes this, and she has these two women killed. Akbar again discovers this and doesn't say anything, and comes back. Everybody comes back to court. But later on, Adham Khan realizes that things have changed too much. His power has been undermined. The power of Mahamanga's clan is now slowly being undermined, because Akbar realizes what is happening. He has realized that the power of the Kokas, the milk mother, families, has to be curtailed, as do the Turkey noblemen, because these are the
yes.
overwhelmingly large number. The Persians are only small at this time. He has to control them. So one day, Adam Khan, because he is very infuriated by these changes, he has Shamsuddin Atka Khan murdered. And Akbar immediately, even though he has a lot of respect for Mahamanga and her family, and for Adam Khan, who is 10 years older to him, his older Koka, he has a lot of respect. But he has him killed. In fact, he punches him very hard himself. He has him thrown over the fort of Agra. And Adam Khan dies. This quick decision that he makes, even within the family which was so close to him, Mahamanga's family, shows that now Akbar will no longer tolerate all questioning of his power, all undermining of his power. And almost immediately in 1562, he meets Raja Bharmal of Amer, this Kachwaha Raja, who says, who presents his daughter to him and says, why don't we form an alliance? And immediately he does this. And Harkabai, but it's not just Harkabai who joins the court, it is also Raja Bharmal, his son Bhagwan Das, Kunwar Man Singh, and this entire coterie, this Rajasthani culture comes into the harem through the women Yeah, because they bring all their culture, all the people, their entourage. Because Akbar says you can carry on with your own religion, with your own religious rites. You can do this in the harem. So all this comes into the heart of the Mughal Empire. The men join as mansabdar, so they slowly start counterbalancing the dangerous element of the only the Turki noblemen. And little by little, in fact, not little by little, quite quickly, Akbar starts also bringing in Indian Sheikhzadas, so Indian Muslim families who have
Yeah,
been
Indian
settled.
Sheikhzadas.
Indian Sheikhzadas also become an important, and by slowly increasing the number, the elements around him, he slowly balances out the very dangerous power that the Uzbeks were having, that the Turkey noblemen were having, and that the milk father foster families were having over him. And he does this immediately and carries on doing this till the end of his empire. Jahangir continues to do this, even Shah Jahan does this. So they have understood that a balancing of these different clans, incorporating them into the empire, is one way to ensure stability.
So again, we saw this is a political wisdom of Akbar as the acts of counterbalancing and establishment of Rajput Mansabdari that goes up to Aurangzeb. When we saw the
Yes.
number of they swell up, though Aurangzeb is not able to manipulate and maintain a balance due to his policies, but definitely the policies continues.
Yes, and sorry, you had said that you can see visibly the changes because right after marrying Harkabai, almost immediately he does away with the pilgrimage tax. Now, the pilgrimage
Yeah.
tax, and he had visited Mathura and he saw that people, the devotees, were gathering in large numbers. He could see that they were really, eager to come and carry out this pilgrimage. And he said it is not fair to tax people just because they are of one religion if they are trying to fulfill their need for this divine succor. So he does away with pilgrimage tax. Almost immediately after that, he does away with the jizya, even though it is opposed by the ulema, it is opposed by a lot of people who say this is our right to have the jizya. But he says, no, it is not right to impose a tax solely on people's religion. And this is a really extraordinary thing that he does so early in his career. We must remember what a young man he is. So early, he understands that this is something which brings inequality, and he does away with it.
So, Ira, can we take one question coming from Lahore? Because this is always came up, and he, being a Lahore wala, he is asking about Anarkali Salim fandoms. So
Okay.
always, it's not related directly to our talk, but because this question always came up, people used to what's about Anarkali Salim, and it's going because just in a short you can give that this is
Yes.
historical fiction or what you want to say.
Yes, I think it is a sort of like a lot of myths which gain traction at this time. So it is actually first, I don't remember which English traveler it is who first mentions the name of Anarkali. It's just slipped my mind. Is it Ralph Fitch or somebody coming by sometime later after the death of Akbar? And he brings up the story of Anarkali that Salim was in love with this courtesan who is supposedly the mother of Daniel, Prince Daniel. And Akbar is very annoyed by this, and he has her entombed in the walls of Lahore. And then Salim, in desperation, builds a tomb for her. But there's no record at all in the Persian literature for 100 years. There's no mention of Anarkali.
No
And
mention.
then somebody again
So
after 100 years comes up.
this is some very popular creation of stories, and many stories creep in. So this is one of the stories.
Yes.
Chittor is really a very tough point for Akbar, but here we saw some aberrancy in his act. Might be a frustrations, usually in his long career or political or monarch times of his kingship. He never touched civilians, but here we saw that he is much infuriated. So either because of those Uzbeks who are again creating a problem, and he was like divided on many fronts or many points, frustrated from Malwa, frustrated from the Gujarat, so many things. What happened at Chittor might be a repercussion of that.
Possibly. Now, it's always difficult and not necessarily useful to see the past, with the lens of today's, reality. The way we see war today is very different from the 16th century. We have notions of, gallantry, of how to treat prisoners of war. All those sort of things did not exist in the 16th century. So first, we must try and, remove those filters and see the 16th century as an extremely violent time where a lot of, aberrations happened. However, we do not expect it from somebody like Akbar, who we think is above all of this. So Important to remember that he is yet a young man. He has really not conquered very much territory of importance in this time. He is only beginning inroads into Rajasthan. Only Raja Bharmal and a few small minor clans have come over to the Mughals. All the big ones are resisting. So this is a very important time in Akbar's career. Also, he has spent 4 long months besieging Chittor and fighting personally. He's in the middle of the fighting of the battles. There are shots firing all over the place, in the narrowly miss killing him too. It is a wonder that he has survived. So
Yes.
maybe some sort of almost post PTSD, that the symptom that comes after being under 4 months of stress and battle conditions. What I think it is also is an essential misalignment in the idea of valor when we think of Timurids and we think of Rajput. Now, the Timurids are very pragmatic, they are very resilient. So, in battle, if they find that they are losing, then they see that there is no dishonor to fall back or to go away for a while and regroup and attack again when they are stronger. They also see no dishonor in surrendering as long as your opponent will give you fair terms. So they do not understand why, after they have besieged Chittor, after they have even breached the walls, they don't understand why the civilian population in the Rajputs continue to fight with whatever they have at hand. For them, this is irrational. They do not understand this. On the other hand, you have the Rajputs whose idea of valor is to die on the battlefield. For them, death is a victory. It is not a loss. As Kshatriyas, they must die on the battlefield. It means immediate immortality. So I think somewhere also there's this mismatch, this misalignment of what it means to be a courageous and brave, follower of your destiny. So something that maybe even Akbar did not understand at this stage about the Rajputs. And certainly we know from the Rajputs that they would not, they had this great kingdom of Chittor which had never been conquered. They had Rana Sangha, the memory of Rana Sangha. They would never, we know that they would never have surrendered. So it was a misunderstanding of how you behave, I think, in battle and in surrender.
The magnitude of the resistance shown by Chittor leads to a frustration. That's the point. So, in many book you talk about lot of huntings of Akbar because this is something very very fond of his. So there is a term very specific. I want audience will learn about it. Kumurga,
Yes,
a
I was
certain
very
style. Yeah, yeah. It's a certain sort of style. Can you talk a little bit about
Yes,
Kumurga?
definitely. So, hunting was a very extremely popular pastime with the noblemen, with the nobility, all through Hindustan. And so it was not unusual for kings to say, now I am going off to a hunt to some other place. So it was almost an excuse for them to travel continuously around the countryside, from one place to the other. And actually, it was a way for them to keep an eye on all their territories, to see, is there rebellion brewing, is there something else happening, are taxes being collected, is there unhappiness with the people. So without making it very obvious that we are coming to see you and to check the provinces, it was a way for them to use this as an excuse and to demonstrate the sort of power they had. It was almost like psychological warfare, if you like, because the Kumarga especially was a very deadly and intense thing. I have an image here because I found when I
Yeah.
was trying to think of how I
Yes.
will talk about it, in my book, I looked up images from the Akbarnama which
Okay.
show this. Huh.
So, can I put it?
This is, yes, this is
This one, huh?
yeah. So this is an image from the Akbarnama, and it shows a Kumarga, I think outside Lahore, possibly. And in this, you see that what happened was that a large space, like sometimes it was several kilometers in diameter, was cordoned off by soldiers all around the edges. They were holding up barriers made of branches, and they were slowly herding all the animals in that territory inside the circle. By the end of it, this enormous circle was teeming with wildlife, with cheetahs, with lions, possibly, with deer, with all sorts of animals. And once they had cordoned off this entire space and the beaters had brought all the animals in the center, then usually Akbar would begin perhaps with a chosen nobleman, maybe Mirza Aziz Koka, and they would ride. Here you can see this is Akbar in the middle. They would ride into the middle of this steaming mass of animals and they would start slaughtering them, using the bow and arrow, using muskets, using sometimes just the dagger, the sword here as he's doing. And they would do this for a few days. Then, after a few days, the noblemen were allowed. And after a few days after that, the lesser noblemen, and then in the end, all the soldiers were allowed to enter this circle, which became narrower and narrower. As the animals were killed, they were pulled out, and the soldiers made the circle smaller and smaller. So what you have by the end is a very dangerous space where men are using all kinds of weapons to kill animals, but also to demonstrate their firepower, to show what good soldiers they are, what accurate marksmen they are, and how deadly it would be to encounter these people in battle. So this was a way for Akbar to show his firepower without actually having to go into battle. So if he suspected an area of having a ruler who was slightly rebellious, he would go on just the pretext, oh, I'm coming to hunt, because this is a good place for hunting. He would create the Kumarga. He would show this impression of power and strength and deadly soldiery that he had, and most people after this would realize that it was perhaps
Right.
better to fall in line than to think of revenge.
So this is a psychological warfare, sort of a frightening created on the enemy's mind. Thank you, Ira. Again, now we are just going to concluding an almost very interesting conversation, goes close to 1 hour. So time doesn't, but Instagram is having issues, but here no issues about or we can continue and finish our talk. So we are just on the some last few points. One is very interesting connection of Sufism we saw with the Mughals from very early days. Central Asia definitely is a bed for Naqshbandi Sufis. Khwaja Arar was one of the founding Sufis who was affiliated with the father of Babar, I think. And Babar has a huge respect. Maybe in his childhood, he has seen some affiliations of his father with this Naqshbandi Sufi. But as they came up to India, we saw that huge or big affiliations with the Chishtis. And Chishtis, where we say like syncretically more Indianized, more blended with the Indian culture and Indian traditions. And they have, by the time of Akbar, they have a larger outreach in Indian masses. So might be this connection is helping as a bridge sometime maybe with the Indian masses. Or what did you say on this switching from one order to other?
I think definitely. I think the Naqshbandis were very powerful in Central Asia, and over there they were very associated with kingship. So they were often very powerful. They were often very wealthy because they were endowed by the kings, and both had a symbiotic relationship. The Naqshbandi Sufis would be protected by the kings, and the kings got the blessings of the saints. So it suited both parties. But the Naqshbandis had a clear agenda to protect all Muslim people, and part of that agenda then meant that even at the cost of the non-believers, if Muslims were under attack by non-believers, then those non-believers must be suitably punished.
Yes.
This was not something which was suiting Akbar with his new vision for Hindustan. And so very early on, in fact, even Humayun was beginning to be influenced by the Kshatris, an Indian also lineage. But Akbar saw the value of the Chishtis because they were enormously popular in India by that time. They had incorporated, as you say, a lot of Hindustani elements into their thinking. They were much more. They kept away from kingships. They were not interfering in politics at all. They stayed separate. And they were more inclined to believe in a cauldron of ideas, of the idea of ishq or love above everything and above sectarian differences. So this was something which would suit Akbar because he not only had Sunnis in his court, he had Shia Persians also, he had local Indian Muslims, he had Rajputs, he had other Hindus slowly joining. So for him, the Chishtis made a lot of sense, at this time, and he became a great devotee, as we know, of Salim Chishti himself and of course of Bajaj.
Like you quoted, Bartoli is great with great and lowly with lowly, and many times he did this during his hunting. Goes to Batiari, goes to a thatched roof, taking a simple meal of an ordinary, or we say below poverty line Indian at that time.
Yes.
So, sorry, Ira, there is a question coming from our friend Syed Mohammad Qasim. So, because he is a tree lover and he ran wonderful wanderers and trees of Delhi, so he is asking about something about the gardens made Akbar time and what were the key trees in his gardens. Really something.
Yes. So what I found very interesting when I was reading about the Mughal gardens at the time of Akbar is that they had to be hard-working gardens. There had to be a reason for those trees and plants to be there. So a lot of fruiting trees, a lot of vegetables, and a lot of flowers that were used either for making fragrances or for just to be used as cut flowers in the palaces. So everything was used, and they had a purpose specific. They were not purely ornamental, let us say. So think, for example, mangoes were very appreciated by Akbar. From Akbar onwards, that they started really loving mangoes. And Akbar had this method. He had devised this new way. He said, to make them even more sweet, he had devised a system of watering them with milk and honey syrup. So he made his gardeners water all his plants with honey syrup so that they would be more tasty and sweeter. So he tried all these experiments in his garden. He made all the vegetables in the kitchen garden for the imperial kitchens to be watered with rose water as well, to give them a better fragrance. So what I liked was that there was often talk of the utility of trees and plants in the kitchen, or in fragrance use, and it wasn't just at this stage, at least, purely ornamental.
So, thank you for this answer. I think Qasim bhai, you have got the answer. There is many other questions are coming, but let's go in our talk and we'll take it later on. Now come to the Fatehpur Sikri, because this is something celebration of a Gujarat victory. But slowly Fatehpur Sikri, we saw a perfect example of blending with different cultures. This is a real syncretic fusion in architecture, and not only the architecture. The later part, we saw the exchanges that happen in Ibadat Khana, and that infuriated many people, and then come up the question of Deen Ilahi and all these things coming up, that from a certain order it says a proclamation of a new religion, but in a one version we say that it's more like a more open dialogues and the debates. Professor Ali Nadeem Rizvi has conducted, who is expert of Fatehpur Sikri, he has conducted a very detailed talk one day on these issues. We can just touch a little bit on this part.
Exactly. So, Professor Rizvi has done so much wonderful work on enlightening us on Fatehpur Sikri. But suffice to say that this decade, 75 to 85 approximately, is hugely important and influential in the Mughal Empire, because its repercussions are seen later on as well. And they are so unique, really, this period of time of Akbar's. So much creativity in every field. It is like, he is on fire, whether it's his mind or his creativity, everything is new. He starts everything anew. So the city, which is built just on a ridge with nothing there except for Salim Chishti's small khanka, he builds this magnificent, city out of nothing. And starting, as you say, with the great arch for the Gujarat victory, and then the mosque, and then slowly he starts building these unusual and curious buildings, which even to today we are still debating what is the use of these things. The Diwan-e-Khas, what was that, that lotus pillar, what was it used for? There are still scholars debating the use of these buildings. So very curious mind. You can see somebody who is willing to try out new things. And the architecture itself fuses all sorts of traditions, where there's the so-called Islamic arch and dome, and then we have the chhatris and the jalis from Rajasthan. From Gujarat, we have the Tabiat and beam structure, the bits of the Haram
Charokas.
Jaroka. They look like temple carvings with elephant styles, decorations. So such a mix and amalgamation of different styles that create this one unique thing. We must remember that there were frescoes and wall paintings as well, which again Professor Vitavi described so wonderfully.
And you cited in your book such details of that frescoes. Yes.
And that makes sense. When we look at today, when you look at Fatehpur Sikri, we do not get an idea of the real beauty and originality of the buildings if we don't try and think of those frescoes and paintings, which showed all sorts of unusual things: European influence, Timurid influence, Christianity, all sorts of things are being shown in there. So we have the buildings themselves coming up, at a fast pace. And Akbar sometimes gets involved. He jumps into they tell us that he starts chiseling along with the stonemasons and starts hammering along with them. He also, gets involved in all this. And at the same time, there's the Ibadat Khana is starting up as well. As we know, the discussions that are taking place, but also is the Translation Bureau, which he has begun around this time as well. So this is a sort of all-round effort to create a new culture, which will bring greater peace between the different rival factions that he has in his empire. Because what is the need to create a translation bureau? According to the way in which Abu al-Fazl says it, he says that it is misunderstanding, which is the cause of strife. When one religion does not understand another religion, doesn't understand its holy books, then there's misunderstanding because you doubt what it says. You don't think it is true. You don't understand it. So he said it is very important to have the translation of these great Hindu texts, which is the Mahabharata is translated at this time, the Razamnama, so that people can read it, the Muslim noblemen can read it and they can understand, and this understanding will bring about greater harmony, will bring about Sulekul. So this translation bureau begins, and we have the great document of the Razamnama, which is the illustrated Persian version of the
Persian
Sanskrit
version of
Mahabharata.
Sanskrit
And we have,
epics, yes.
yeah, wonderful scene where Sanskrit scholars are sitting, Persian scholars are sitting, and they're both talking to each other, understanding the essence of these texts. They have to tell Akbar also because he is checking all the translations himself, making sure that they are telling the truth. And one time when Badauni writes something in the translation, Akbar shouts at him and says, "Are you trying to bring in some Islamic meaning into this book?" And Badauni has to explain himself, but he is very careful about what is being written. So this wonderful, translation bureau is there for the express purpose of aiding in this new syncretic, if you like to call it, but this new culture which is coming up with all these different elements, which are also reflected in the architecture, reflected in the conversations which are taking place at the Ibadat Khana. So all these things in this one decade are happening simultaneously.
So a question came up. Could you tell us something about Akbar's architect? I found many of them were from Kabul, or is there any architecture school at that time?
I'm not sure if there was an architecture school at that time. Of course, we know that Humayun's tomb, Mirza Ghias was an architect, from Central Asia, from Persia. So, but I am not sure. And he was, he contributed in a great way to the structure of Humayun's tomb. Um, so we did have architects coming in from Persia. But what was the local, whether there was a local architecture school, I have not, come across anything like that. So I don't think so.
But definitely the influence of the local architecture was there. It
Of
is quite
course,
visible there.
of
And
course, it
because
was.
workforce is there, ideas is there. And we also saw the compilation of Mankarit. You talk about a patronization of epic that was written on the Rajputs, and this is really a great work that's going on side by side during the time of Akbar,
Yeah.
and a big work for add on to the literature.
That's right, because it's not enough to look at the Persian language literature, which is coming out of the court, and those sort of texts which tell us about the imperial culture. It's very interesting to look at the sub-imperial courts. So the texts which are written in Braj Bhasha, for example, and we know because of Alison Bush's work on it, extraordinary work that she has done. A lot of Braj Bhasha texts were coming out at this time. For a long time, these texts were ignored because it was believed that Viti literature, the colonial narrative was that Viti literature somehow is not as important as Hindi literature, so it was ignored for a long time. Now scholars are looking at Braj Bhasha again. And what happened is that a lot of the Rajput, Mansabdars who have joined the Mughal Empire, now they also have to create a legacy for themselves. Their bards, their singers, their charans, they will sing these songs, they will tell their tales. So this literature is written for the glory of the king, the local king, whether it's Raja Man Singh or Bir Singh Deo of Orcha. They are having works created for them, and they are meant to be heard by their noblemen. So they will hear this in Rajasthani or in Braj Bhasha, and so they must find a way to negotiate this new Mughal reality in which their local Rajas are no longer the biggest and most powerful people in the system. Now they are part of the Mughal Empire. So there are very interesting ways, the interesting language in which they refer to the Mughals, they refer to Akbar. And in the Manchariks, for example, uh, uh, the poet uses he uses Braj Bhasha, but he also uses a lot of Persianized texts, and he throws in a few Arabic words. Because he feels that this is the new reality, so my text should have some of this language in it as well. And he talks of Akbar, and he says he is born in the lineage of Timur. He is the son of Humayun. He is revered in the three worlds by all heroic men. He is an avatar descended to earth to destroy the suffering of others. So
So this is their version or their understanding, and or their own cultural or socio-religious aspect came up here to give the
exactly
legacy to the king.
correct. So this is
There is a question from Tarun Verma. What inspired Akbar to write his history Akbarnama with the help of Abul Fazl? Is the European influence? I think there is a long trend of writing biographies in the Eastern world, long from the days of Baghdad or Abbasid Empire to India also. The Indian monarchs also used to write it. I think
there we've had the different sort of writing of history. It just the Europeans did not consider it on par with their biographies, but through the Islamic world, we got biographies from the Islamic world. It is not from
yeah,
the Europe. Yeah.
yes, and Shraddha Kale asked tell us something about Akbar's daughters, whether he has daughters, and is there any?
Thank you, Shraddha, for that question, because we know that there's something very moving and poignant that we know about his daughters, is that when they were born, Abu al-Fazl writes that Akbar said that we must make sure that their birth is celebrated in the same way that we celebrate the birth of sons. So it is really wonderful to know that in today's day, when we still have to use slogans like Beti Padhao, Beti Bachao, in Akbar's time, he was making sure that the birth of daughters was being celebrated with the same magnificence as that of sons. He did not want to show any inequality in the two. We know that they were very well educated, but we don't know a great deal more of their lives because they really stayed. They were probably the ones who were most affected by Abu al-Fazl's idea of this restricted harem. So they stayed quite cloistered. We do not hear a great deal about their lives apart from the fact that Akbar made sure that they were educated and that they were celebrated and loved in the same way as the sons were.
Let's just move to the last point and then we can close our talk. If there is any question, we can take it. The last decade of Akbar's life is. Are you taking? Yeah, we are taking all the questions. I think this is just a last concluding point. So the last decade of his life, we saw the slipping of power, though he is not very old in the age, but is a long time on the throne. And we saw that power was loosened, and in 10 years he's moving all around with his huge camps, sometime to suppress the rebels, sometime going to the frontiers, sometime going to Bihar expedition to curb Afghans. Again, within the family, the princes are losing the power. One of them lost the life. Deccan expedition, again, that's a reason of the fall of Mughal Empire later on. We saw it by the time of Aurangzeb and after the death of Aurangzeb. But this is how its last phase can be explained in a way that the man who built up a lot of things, who created the ideas, the man of Ibadat Khana, the man of Tasveer Khana, but suddenly we saw 10 years it's like up and downs. There is a lot of vibrance in that time.
Yes. So, exactly. So I think in the end, Akbar is undone by his own sons. Because what happens, as we were discussing earlier, there's this system of co-sovereignty. So we don't know who will be king after Akbar. There's no specific person. In fact, Akbar even does away with the system of appanage. In the earlier Timurid system, all the sons were given a territory. They were almost semi-independent. They could go there with their soldiers, rule that place almost like semi-independent, princes. This is not happening under Akbar. He does away with this system. Now Hindustan will remain one unit and only one son will inherit it. So this starts to create a lot of sense of rivalry among the three sons because they stay at court. And so they're always with each other in this claustrophobic environment and also in the shadow of this great father. So it seems to them that they will never achieve what Akbar has achieved, and they don't even know if they will ever get to become king. Salim really begins to wonder if he will ever become king because Akbar starts to undermine him. And slowly he starts favoring the grandsons.
Yes.
Khurram and Khusro, they start coming up, and he openly tells people, I prefer my grandsons. So Salim becomes very uncertain. He really doubts what will happen to him later on. And so at last, Akbar decides to send Murad and Danyal away from court, the other two sons. He tries to send Salim. Salim refuses to go. He realizes that being at the center of power means being close to the imperial court. So there are a lot of these frictions and tensions. another reason was this amazing, overpowering figure of a father was too much for Murad and Daniel, and both become alcoholics, and they eventually die of alcoholism. They are not able to, stand up to the legacy of their father. Only Salim is able to, in some sense. And finally, by 1600, Salim has started courting all the rebels that Akbar doesn't like. So the Kashmiri rebels, the Afghan rebels, some of Mirza Hakim's, followers, all come to Salim's court. And in 1600 in Allahabad, he says that this is my own court, and he declares himself Shah Salim, and almost says that he is a rival for the throne right away. So these are very difficult times for Akbar to negotiate. First, he sends Muhammad Sharif, who is a painter, as an ambassador to try and reason with Salim. But instead, Muhammad Sharif joins Salim's court. Then he sends Abu al-Fazl, and we know what happens to Abu al-Fazl. Abu al-Fazl is sadly murdered by Salim's friend, Bir Singh Deo. So these are very sad times for Akbar. He loses his favorite courtiers. They're all dying now. Raja Bhagwan Das, Birbal is dead, Kansen also dies. So, all these old stalwarts of his court have now, died. A few of the ladies are left in the harem, Hamida Banu and Gulbadan. And we get a sense of the isolation of the Pasha now, as slowly, his son, only Salim remains in the end. The other two have died. So you do get a sense of disquiet that he is actually in the end undone by the system with his sons.
Thank you, Ira. There is few questions and then we can conclude our talk. We have finished it. First of all, Ananya, I think we have given your answer. Right now, Ira told that why Khusro, grandson Khusro, to be a successor. No,
I think he preferred Khurram to all of them.
Yes.
Yeah. And he said, I see in Khurram my true descendant, a true inheritor of my legacy. And of course, Khurram becomes Shah Jahan. So perhaps
till his deathbed, he was there, and Salim was very insecure about it. And this explained in a book, much detail. There is a complete chapter on that. Amir Khan, he's a historian now, but before he was a doctor. So he is doing PhD. He's doing a PhD. He's a dentist by his background, but now he's doing PhD in history, really. So he switched his profession in a love of history. He's also a good Urdu poet. So probably some of the coming talk he is going to host in our handle. So here's a good question. Yeah, Deen Ilahi don't pick up, especially the ambience was so syncretic. I think Ira will give an answer, but before I just want to add from the words what I listened from Professor Ali Nadeem Rizvi, because he did a lot of Rizavi did talks on this topic. So he say, in fact, this is not a religion how it was proposed. It's certain sort of experiment that was done with Akbar. Few of his very close successors was actually following it, and it is also not clear whether they are following it like a religion. And suddenly when Akbar went away, this got to be finished. And Ira, you can now give your answer.
That is exactly right. It was never meant as a religion. I think it was meant more as a peer-murid relationship.
Yes,
that Akbar had like a peer, like a Sufi peer. He is sharing a relationship with his murid, with his closest, and it was an elite system, only for a few chosen noblemen, not the masses. We think that hundreds of people were lining up to become a part of this religion. This was not so. It was a very close peer-murid sort of relationship between a few close followers who understood Akbar's thinking, the sort of man he was, and the sort of thinking that was. So it was never intended to be a mass-scale religion which would continue after he had gone away.
Thank you, Shraddha. I think this is a very open question. Ira can answer it. Akbar balances life with regal duties.
So, Shraddha, that's an excellent question. And the fact is that actually there is no difference, between private life and regal life. If we study the works of Ruby Lal, for example, in her groundbreaking work on the early Mughal harem, domesticity and power in the early Mughal world, she says that there's no demarcation, there's no clear demarcation between public life and private life, that the women were part of it. So if you remember that Kumarga picture that I showed you, in the middle of the Kumarga circle, there's a tent with the ladies of the harem. They have accompanied Akbar on this hunting expedition, as they accompany him everywhere. Wherever he goes, the wives, the aunts, the mother, sometimes, not always, but the wives and children definitely follow, whether they are pregnant or whether they have small children, they go along with him. So the affairs of the domestic sphere and the public sphere is not so clearly marked as Abu al-Fazl would want us to think, that they are only in this space in Fatehpur Sikri, they are Pardegyan. Actually, they are traveling everywhere. They are part
Yes.
of the formation of empire.
And this continued to be a part of their, they probably arrived from their nomadic culture, but this goes on till the days of the last time of Mughal Empire. Just the last question that we missed about Qasim Bhai, what about the avenue trees?
Yes, that's a good question. And when I was reading up about Delhi, when Akbar was passing with his retinue through Delhi, there was a talk of Delhi being a city of waterways and of trees, and that every avenue was lined with trees. So I thought this was a wonderful thing. And of course, at that time, the Yamuna was much closer to what we consider city center in Nizamuddin Aulia's Dargah and that space, Humayun's tomb. It was right by Humayun's tomb, and from there all you could see were trees. So avenue trees were definitely there and planted so as to provide shade, and it was something that was done specifically in the great imperial cities.
Thanks to all of you. I think it was a great time, more than 1 hour. I think 1 hour 26 minutes. I'm ending the broadcast just from here.